I'm not saying I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world. Tupac uttered those words long before his heart stopped at 4:03, September 13th, 1996, in a Las Vegas hospital room. But here is the irony. He was wrong. He didn't just spark a brain, he became immortal. Ask yourself, wait 3 decades after his death, does a rapper who lived only 25 years remain the most influential figure in global culture? Why does his voice still resonate in the headphones of teenagers born 20 years after his funeral? Why are his poems studied at Ivy League universities alongside Shakespeare, while his face has become an international shorthand for resistance? The truth is, Tupac Shakur was never just a musician. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the system, a prophet who scripted his own demise with haunting precision. Today, we aren't just recounting the facts of his biography, we are staring into the abyss of his contradictions. We are deconstructing how a boy who studied ballet became America's most wanted outlaw. And we are exploring why the world still refuses to believe that on that September evening at the corner of Flamingo Road, and he actually left us. Prepare yourself. This is the story of a rose that didn't just grow from concrete, it cracked the pavement forever. There is a fundamental difference between popularity and immortality. Popularity is a commodity with an expiration date. It is tethered to charts, algorithms, and fleeting trends. Immortality, however, is a state where a person's voice continues to echo long after the era that birthed it has fallen silent. Tupac Amaru Shakur is that rarest of cases in modern history, a personality that outgrew its own biography to become a digital and spiritual deity. His immortality isn't the result of clever marketing. To understand this phenomenon, one must view Tupac as the intersection of several global forces: radical politics, classical art, personal tragedy, and a nearly supernatural sense of foresight. The primary secret to his longevity in our collective memory is unresolved contradiction. The human mind craves harmony, but the human heart is always drawn to chaos. Tupac was the living embodiment of that chaos. He was a conscious intellectual who could quote Niccolo Machiavelli and Friedrich Nietzsche, yet he was also a participant in street wars, his life saturated with the aesthetics of violence. He was the tender son who wrote Dear Mama, an anthem that makes the toughest men weep. And he was also the author of Hit 'Em Up, the most poisonous and ruthless diss track in the history of music. This duality transformed him into a universal mirror. In him, everyone finds what they are looking for. The rebel sees a revolutionary, the poet sees a delicate lyricist, the outlaw sees one of their own. The sociologist sees a victim of a broken system. He didn't offer ready-made answers. He was the question itself. Tupac lived a mere quarter century. In ancient Greek tragedies, this was the age of heroes who challenged the gods and perished at the absolute peak of their radiance. There is a certain magic to a short life. Had Tupac lived to be 60, would he have become just another respectable businessman selling sneakers or headphones? Perhaps. But his death at 25 froze his image in a state of eternal, boiling energy. He remained forever young, forever furious, and forever searching. His immortality is fueled by the fact that he never had a cooling down period. He left behind thousands of hours of recordings and hundreds of poems, creating the sensation that his creative flow was infinite. This birthed a modern mythology. People refused to believe in the biological death of someone who radiated such intense life force. For millions, he didn't die, he simply transitioned. Another pillar of his eternity is prophetic accuracy. Listening to his tracks today in 2026, you are struck by how relevant his words remain regarding social inequality, systemic racism, and the fragility of human life. He wasn't just describing the reality of the 90s. He was exposing the clockwork of human nature and the American dream, mechanisms that haven't changed in decades. He often spoke of his death as if he were reading the script of his own future. This fatalism, this expectation of the end, and the readiness for it, gave his persona the aura of a martyr. In the mass consciousness, he has taken a seat alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. But with one key difference: Tupac spoke the language of the streets, a language of beats and rhymes understood by every teenager on the planet. His metaphor of the rose that grew from concrete became his personal crest. The phenomenon of Shakur's immortality lies in the fact that he proved beauty is possible at the epicenter of ugliness. His life was a brief but blinding proof that the spirit can triumph over circumstance. In this exploration, we aren't just opening a chapter on a rapper. We are beginning a study of how one man became the voice of a generation and how that voice, defying the laws of physics, only grows louder with every passing year. Tupac Shakur didn't just exist, he is. And his immortality is the result of his ability to be raw, vulnerable, and authentic in a world that always demands a mask. To truly understand Tupac, you must first understand the woman who created him. His story does not begin in a recording studio or on a movie set. It begins in a courtroom amidst the height of 1970s political paranoia and systemic persecution. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was not merely a parent. She was an ideologue, a warrior, and the living embodiment of resistance. In 1969, Afeni, along with 20 other members of the Black Panther Party, was arrested in a case that became known as the Panther 21. They were charged with a massive conspiracy to bomb police stations and public landmarks in New York City. The U.S. government, through the FBI's COINTELPRO program, had marked the Panthers as the single greatest internal threat to the nation, seeking to dismantle them by any means necessary. Afeni spent the majority of her pregnancy with Tupac behind the bars of the Greenwich Village Women's House of Detention. Facing up to 150 years in prison and distrusting the state's legal machine, she made an unprecedented move. She decided to represent herself in court, despite having no formal legal training. She was 8 months pregnant when she stood before the jury, arguing that her organization was fighting not against people, but against oppression. In May 1971, just 1 month before her son was born, Afeni and her co-defendants were acquitted of all 156 counts. On June 16, 1971, in East Harlem, Lasan Parish Crooks was born. However, a year later, Afeni officially changed his name to Tupac Amaru Shakur. This was a calculated political act. The name belonged to the last Incan monarch who led a rebellion against Spanish colonizers in Peru and was brutally executed. "I wanted him to have the name of revolutionary people in the world," Afeni once said. "I wanted him to know he was part of a world culture and not just from a neighborhood." The surname Shakur is Arabic for thankful to God. Tupac's childhood was saturated with the ideology of Black consciousness. There were no fairy tales about superheroes in his house. His heroes were his uncle, Geronimo Pratt, a high-ranking Panther, and his stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, who would later land on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for his role in the prison break of Assata Shakur. Tupac grew up surrounded by men and women who viewed themselves as prisoners of war within their own country. This forged a unique psychological profile. He was a child who understood constitutional rights and police surveillance tactics before he even learned how to drive. Yet, beneath this ideological power lay a devastating, grinding poverty. The Shakur family was constantly on the move, not always running from the law, but always running from debt and hunger. They moved dozens of times. Tupac often felt like a perpetual outsider with no chance to make lasting friends. "I used to cry in my room because I didn't feel like I had a place in this world," he confessed in later interviews. This early isolation forced him inward, into a world of fantasy, poetry, and acting. Even in their darkest financial moments, Afeni demanded intellectual excellence. She would make Tupac read the New York Times from front to back every day and report on the world's events. She was raising a Black prince, a boy who was taught that his mind was his greatest weapon against a system designed to see him fail. This was the gene of revolution passed down to him. Tupac didn't just inherit his mother's eyes or her smile, he inherited her defiance. He was born into a war that had been raging long before he arrived, and he was named after a king who refused to bow. He was the rose that was already fighting the concrete before it even broke the surface. In 1986, the Shakur family migrated from the high-tension streets of New York to Baltimore, Maryland. If the first decade of Tupac's life was defined by the politics of fire, his time in Baltimore would be defined by the sanctuary of the stage. This period represents the golden age of his youth, a brief, shining window where the world saw Tupac not as a threat, but as a prodigy. Tupac's admission to the Baltimore School for the Arts, Biography, was a seismic shift in his trajectory. For the first time, his environment didn't just demand survival, it demanded expression. Here, the boy who had spent his life running from the ghosts of the FBI was suddenly wearing tights for ballet class and studying the intricate meter of Irish poetry. He wasn't just a student, he was a phenomenon. His teachers recalled a young man who possessed a frighteningly high level of charisma. While his peers were trying to fit in, Tupac was busy standing out. He played the Mouse King in the Nutcracker and took on the heavy mantle of Hamlet. It is in these Shakespearean tragedies that Tupac found a mirror for his own life. He saw the same themes of betrayal, the weight of the crown, and the inevitability of fate that he witnessed on the street corners. He realized that a king in 16th century Denmark and a young man in 20th century Baltimore were fighting the same demons. It was in the hallways of BSA that Tupac met his intellectual and spiritual match, Jada Pinkett. Their bond was an anomaly in the world of celebrity, a platonic, fierce, and protective love between two kids who had nothing but their dreams. Jada recalled that Tupac was the living embodiment of a question mark. He was a rapper who loved Don McLean's Vincent, a street kid who cried over poetry, and a revolutionary who could make the entire cafeteria laugh. They made a pact to change the world together. To the outside world, they were just two black kids from the wrong side of the tracks, but inside the school, they were royalty. This period of intellectual safety allowed Tupac to develop the duality that would later define his music. The ability to be a warrior and a poet simultaneously. But while Tupac was flourishing under the stage lights, the foundation of his home was rotting. The crack cocaine epidemic of the mid-'80s was a plague that didn't care about revolutionary pedigree. Afeni Shakur, the woman who had survived the U.S. government, began to lose her battle with the pipe. This was the ultimate betrayal for Tupac. His queen, the woman who taught him to read the New York Times, was becoming a stranger. The household became a place of shadows and secrets. The contrast was agonizing. By day, he was reciting the high-minded monologues of the masters. By night, he was coming home to a mother who was disappearing before his eyes. It was during these turbulent years that Tupac wrote his most famous poem, The Rose That Grew from Concrete. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. This wasn't just a poem, it was his autobiography. The concrete was the poverty, the drug addiction, and the systemic oppression. The rose was himself and every other kid in Baltimore who was trying to be beautiful in a place that didn't want them to exist. He argued that you don't look at a rose in the concrete and ask why its petals are bruised. You marvel at the fact that it had the strength to break through the ground at all. In 1988, just as Tupac was finding his voice, the dream was cut short. Due to his mother's escalating addiction and the family's dire financial situation, they were forced to pack their few belongings and move across the country to Oakland, California. The departure from Baltimore was a trauma Tupac would never truly recover from. He cried as he said goodbye to Jada and his teachers. He felt he was being pulled away from the light and thrown back into the darkness. If Baltimore was the school of the soul, Oakland was to be the school of the streets. The boy who left Baltimore was a poet. The young man who arrived in Oakland would have to become a soldier. If Baltimore was a dream of what Tupac could be, Oakland was the reality of what the world expected him to be. In 1988, 17-year-old Tupac arrived in the San Francisco Bay Area, landing in the rugged, neglected pockets of Marin City in Oakland. This wasn't the California of Hollywood glitz. This was the jungle, a landscape dominated by the crack trade, police sirens, and a sense of terminal hopelessness. In Oakland, the dual life Tupac had led finally collapsed. The Black Prince of the Arts was gone. In his place was a young man who was effectively homeless. His mother's addiction had reached a breaking point, and Tupac often found himself sleeping in parks or on the couches of strangers. This is the era where the thug life philosophy began to crystallize. To the casual observer, thug was a pejorative, a label for a criminal. But to Tupac, it was a badge of survival. He began to realize that for a young black man with no father, no money, and a drug-addicted mother, the polite path was a dead end. He started hanging out with the hustlers and the street soldiers, Not because he wanted to be a criminal, but because they were the only ones who seemed to have any power in a world that wanted him invisible. Tupac's entry into the music industry was anything but glamorous. In 1990, he managed to land an audition with Digital Underground, a fun-loving, P-Funk-inspired hip-hop collective led by Shock G. Shock G didn't hire him as a rapper. He hired him as a roadie and a backup dancer. Tupac spent months carrying heavy speakers, setting up stages, and performing the Humpty Dance in ridiculous costumes. But behind the scenes, Tupac was a silent observer. While the rest of the group partied, Tupac sat in the back of the tour bus with a notebook, writing at a feverish pace. He was recording the pain of Oakland, the history of his mother, and the rage of a generation. His big break came in 1991 with the track Same Song. It was his first appearance on a professional recording. When Tupac stepped into the booth, the atmosphere changed. He didn't have the laid-back, goofy energy of Digital Underground. He had a raw, percussive frequency that demanded attention. In the music video, he appeared dressed as an African king carried on a litter, a visual bridge between his revolutionary roots and his future stardom. In November 1991, Tupac released his solo debut, Tupacalypse Now. It was a tectonic shift in hip-hop. While the genre was split between the party rap of the West Coast and the lyrical boom bap of the East, Tupac introduced something else, the CNN of the ghetto. The album was a brutal, unvarnished look at police brutality, teen pregnancy, and systemic neglect. The centerpiece was Brenda's Got a Baby, a haunting tale of a 12-year-old girl who ends up in a trash compactor after a desperate struggle with poverty. It wasn't a hit in the traditional sense. It was a mourning cry. It proved that Tupac wasn't just a rapper. He was a journalist of the streets. The establishment's reaction was swift and terrified. In 1992, a Texas youth shot a state trooper, and his defense claimed he was under the influence of Tupac's music. This sparked a national firestorm. Then Vice President Dan Quayle publicly denounced the album, stating, "There is no reason for a record like this to be published. It has no place in our society." For any other artist, this might have been a career killer. For Tupac, it was a baptism. He realized that if the Vice President of the United States was afraid of his lyrics, then his lyrics had power. He leaned into the controversy, embracing the role of the rebel that his mother had prepared him for since birth. He wasn't just a kid from Oakland anymore. He was a political target. Tupac had successfully sparked the brain, but as the spotlight intensified, the shadows around him began to grow. The line between the revolutionary and the outlaw was about to vanish. As Tupac's musical career ignited, a second front opened, Hollywood. In 1992, he starred as Bishop in the film Juice. It is widely considered one of the greatest acting debuts in cinematic history. Tupac didn't just play the role of a spiraling, murderous teenager. He inhabited it with a terrifying intensity. But this success came with a heavy price. Many who were close to him during this time noticed a shift in his personality. The Bishop persona, dark, volatile, and obsessed with juice, power, began to bleed into Tupac's real life. He started getting into more frequent altercations with the police and rival groups. He was trapped in a feedback loop. The more he acted like a thug, the more the media loved him. And the more the media loved him, the more he felt he had to live up to the image. He was no longer just the rose in the concrete. He was becoming the concrete itself. If 1992 was the year Tupac became a star, 1993 was the year he became a legend of the legal system. Two events occurred that would define the rest of his life: the Atlanta shooting and the sexual assault trial. In October 1993, while in Atlanta, Tupac saw two white off-duty police officers harassing a black man on the street. Without hesitation, Tupac intervened. A fight broke out, and Tupac ended up shooting both officers. To the mainstream media, this was proof of his gangster nature, but when it was revealed in court that the officers were intoxicated and had been using a stolen weapon to threaten the civilian, the charges against Tupac were dropped. For the black community, this wasn't an act of a criminal. It was the act of a hero. Tupac had done what many only dreamed of. He had stood his ground against the police and won. He was now a folk hero, a modern-day Robin Hood. However, the high of the Atlanta victory was short-lived. In November 1993, Tupac was charged with sexual assault following an incident in a New York hotel room. The details were murky, the witnesses were unreliable, and Tupac vehemently denied the charges until his death, claiming he was set up by associates he trusted. This trial was a turning point. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a character assassination. The man who wrote "Keep Your Head Up" was now being labeled a predator. This cognitive dissonance tore at Tupac's soul. He felt betrayed by the very people he fought for, and he began to retreat into a darker, more paranoid state of mind. November 30th, 1994, the night before the verdict of his sexual assault trial was to be delivered. Tupac arrived at Quad Recording Studios in Times Square to record a verse for another artist. As he entered the lobby, three men approached him, demanding his jewelry. But this wasn't a standard robbery. Tupac, ever the warrior, reached for his own gun. In the ensuing struggle, he was shot 5 times, twice in the head, once in the arm, and twice in the groin. The attackers fled, leaving him for dead. Miraculously, Tupac survived. Bleeding and in shock, he rode the elevator up to the studio, where he found his friend, the notorious B.I.G. and Sean Puffy Combs. In Tupac's eyes, their reaction wasn't one of concern, but of guilt. He believed they had set him up, or at the very least, knew it was going to happen and didn't warn him. This moment was the spark that ignited the East Coast-West Coast War. It turned a personal trauma into a cultural conflict. The following day, with bandages on his head and a look of pure defiance in his eyes, Tupac appeared in court in a wheelchair. He was found guilty of sexual abuse and sentenced to 1.5 to 4.5 years in prison. While incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility, Tupac released what many consider his masterpiece, Me Against the World. Recorded before his imprisonment, but released while he was behind bars, the album is a haunting, introspective look at a man who knows his time is running out. Gone was the bravado of the Juice era. In its place was a deep, soul-crushing melancholy. In tracks like So Many Tears and Death Around the Corner, Tupac discussed his own mortality with a chilling casualness. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making Tupac the first artist in history to have a #1 record while serving a prison sentence. Tupac's time in prison was a period of intense intellectual growth. He read Machiavelli's The Prince, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and the works of Van Gogh. But he also felt abandoned. While he sat in a cell, the hip-hop world continued to turn. He felt his friends had turned their backs on him. He was broke, his legal fees were mounting, and his spirit was beginning to break. That is, until a man named Suge Knight arrived with a contract and $1 million bail check. In October 1995, the gates of Clinton Correctional Facility opened, and Tupac Shakur walked out a different man. He was no longer just a rapper or a poet, he was a ticking time bomb. Waiting for him was a white limousine and Suge Knight, the CEO of Death Row Records. Suge had paid Tupac's $1.4 million bail, but it wasn't a gift. It was an investment. Tupac had signed a contract on a napkin, promising 3 albums to the most dangerous label in the world. Tupac didn't go home. He didn't go to a hotel. He went straight to the studio. He was driven by a frantic energy, a feeling that his time was short. In just 2 weeks, he recorded All Eyes on Me, the first double-disc album in hip-hop history. The sound had changed. The dusty, conscious beats of his early career were replaced by the high-gloss, bass-heavy G-funk of the West Coast. Tupac wasn't just rapping, he was celebrating his freedom and declaring war on his enemies. Tracks like Ambitions is a Rida and California Love became the anthems of an era. He was at the absolute peak of his commercial power, but he was also at the center of a gathering storm. The paranoia that began at Quad Studios had now blossomed into a full-scale obsession. Tupac was convinced that the notorious B.I.G. and Puff Daddy were responsible for his shooting. On June 4th, 1996, he released Hit 'Em Up. This wasn't just a diss track, it was a verbal execution. It was raw, personal, and crossed every line of rap etiquette. By attacking Biggie's wife and his entire crew, Tupac turned a musical rivalry into a territorial war, East Coast versus West Coast. The media fueled the fire, and the fans took sides. The tension in the hip-hop community became so thick it was suffocating. By late 1996, Tupac seemed to be looking for an exit. He was talking about starting his own film company, getting into politics, and leaving death row. He felt Suge Knight was becoming too controlling. But before he could make his move, he had one last trip to make. Tupac arrived in Las Vegas for the Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon fight at the MGM Grand. After the fight in the casino lobby, Tupac spotted Orlando Anderson, a member of the Southside Crips who had allegedly robbed a death row associate months earlier. Fueled by the ride-or-die loyalty of death row, Tupac attacked Anderson. The scuffle was caught on security cameras. It would be the last footage of Tupac alive. Hours later, Tupac was riding in the passenger seat of Suge Knight's black BMW 750 sedan. They were headed to Club 662. At 11:15 p.m., a white Cadillac pulled up alongside them at a red light on Flamingo Road. A hand emerged from the back window. 14 shots were fired. Tupac was hit 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the arm, and once in the thigh. Suge was grazed by a fragment. As the Cadillac sped off into the neon darkness of the Vegas night, the world changed. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. For 6 days he fought. He had a lung removed, he was put on life support. His mother, Afeni, sat by his side. On September 13, 1996, at 4:03 p.m., she gave the order to let him go. Tupac was gone, but the mystery was just beginning. Within weeks, the conspiracy theories started. Shortly after his death, his final album, The Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory, was released under the pseudonym Machiavelli. The name was a nod to Niccolò Machiavelli, who famously suggested faking one's death to evade enemies. Fans pointed to clues. Tupac was shot on the 7th. He died 7 days later. He was 25 years old. 2 + 5 = 7. In the Toss It Up video, he's wearing sneakers that hadn't been released yet at the time of his shooting. While the Tupac is on a beach in Cuba, theories provided comfort to fans. The reality was much darker. His murder remained unsolved for nearly 30 years, fueling decades of distrust in the police and speculation about government involvement. Tupac Shakur was a man of 1,000 faces. He was the thug, the poet, the revolutionary, and the actor. He was a human being who was pathologically honest about his flaws, and that is why we cannot let him go. He didn't live to see the first black president. He didn't live to see hip-hop become the most dominant culture on earth. But he provided the blueprint. He taught a generation that you can be vulnerable and strong at the same time. He taught us that even if you are born in the concrete, you have a right to reach for the sun. Tupac didn't just change music. He changed the way we talk about race, poverty, and the American dream. He was the spark he promised to be. As we look back at his life, the 25 years of fire and light, we realize that the white Cadillac might have stopped his heart, but it couldn't stop his voice. Because as long as there is a rose in the concrete looking for a way out, Tupac lives.